community-led and driven organisation. So it's great this evening that Paul's come along to give us a talk. Paul is a long-standing member of the community. How long have you come?
A little over 2 years, I think.
2 years. So first talk. So maybe the first of many. But if any of you've got any ideas, talks, we're doing some lightning talks this year, hopefully at some point. So believe me, anyone can stand up and talk tech for 15 minutes. It's not that hard. But if you've got an idea for a longer talk, project you want to talk about, then you can talk to me, Rich or Matt. Matt's at home tonight because his family are going to Poland. He basically regrets not being here this evening and apologises, but he will watch it on YouTube. So at the end of the month, so we've got two meetups this month. You lucky people.
And thank you for turning up mid-month and not getting confused.
Yeah.
Like the security guys.
At the end of the month, we've got Alexa.net, so if you're interested in sort of chatbot and liaising with computers by voice, the form of voice. We've got Steve Pearce coming to talk about an open source library he maintains. So use .net to integrate with Alexa. And then we've got a little IoT in the following month. So someone's developed a robotic hand that someone replaces someone's arm. It goes all the way up to here and allows, he's got this sort of Xamarin application on here, and it programs the arm to give it different motions and gestures. So all about his experience doing that kind of project. And then in June, we have John Skeet. Has anyone heard of John Skeet? So you may have noticed that RSVPs are not open yet. That's because I fully expect lots of people to RSVP and then not turn up. We might have to get a bigger place for that. John Skeet, you don't know, he's a very well-known speaker, international speaker.
And he's very nice too.
Yeah, and he's a very nice guy. So we're coming up from Reading to talk to us. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Platform obviously for giving us the room, and Fruition IT for sponsoring the beer and pizza. We have a new chap on the block, Liam, this evening. Now, I know you're going, oh, where's Fran? Unfortunately, Fran's not with us anymore. And I know what you're going, oh, what about the, if I get a job, I get a free hug offer that Fran had going. Well, Liam can do a good man hug, but he, if you come in the pub afterwards, he might buy you a beer as well. So, Liam, please say hello to Liam and Fruition, and thank you for sponsoring us. And without further ado, unless you have anything else.
That's all sponsors. Yeah, no, nothing else.
Yeah, cool.
Thank you very much.
Over to you.
Okay, I'm going to do 2 intros. Cool. Right, good evening. Welcome to Leeds Sharp on February the 13th, 2020, which is an extra session. I'm Paul Irving, I work at TransUnion here in Leeds. Always looking for good people, so feel free to review the website. Let's get going. So, tonight we're going to try and understand what logic apps and serverless functions are, when to use them, when not to use them. Hopefully we've got enough time to do the full life cycle. The function apps and serverless functions, and then moving on to logic apps, a review of the demo that I put together. Security considerations, we're not going to do a deep dive on that because that would be 2 hours or more all by itself. Serverless thinking, so because the first part of this talk is all about development, it's important to understand that it's a tool that needs to be used correctly, so we'll talk about serverless thinking, lessons learned from a couple of years of doing this, and a nice surprise at the end for the running costs of adopting serverless technology. So the code is not advanced. We're going to take it easy this evening, so if you're either new to C# or new to these technologies, it's at the right level. Hopefully quite a bit of real world experience. We'll be looking at the PowerShell and ARM elements of Azure, what's out, C#, lessons. Like I said, it's not advanced coding. I haven't even put much error handling in. I'm not going to spend too much time sort of telling you what Azure is. I think that's a given. In the same way as we're not going to go into a deep dive on security, we're not going to talk much about the API manager. We'll come back to what it is and what it will do for us, but it's not included in the talk this evening. Application insights again, so if you're familiar with Azure, you know that application insights is how you get your metrics. We don't need to go into that this evening, and yeah, we're not going into the deep dive on the security. So in order to use the serverless functions, we need a few prerequisites. So you are going to need to sorry, this takes a little minute.
As long as you're not installing Visual Studio from scratch.
It's what?
As long as you're not installing Visual Studio.
No. I'm just showing you that it's installed, and I've got my zoomer. So yeah, you're going to need to enable the Azure development option, and again, if you're specifically doing function apps, then you're going to need Azure Functions and WebJob Tools feature enabled. So once you've got those enabled, you'll be able to choose to create a new function app. So can we see that? Should we zoom it in? So for the purposes of tonight, we're just going to look at the HTTP trigger. But I guess for a bit of context, it's worth knowing all the different things that a function app can do for you. So typically speaking, you want to try and get to the point where your data is in a queue or a table. So this has been discussed by some of the evangelists. So typically we'll demo with a HTTP trigger, but a HTTP trigger is an unpredictable workload. So what we really want to do is have HTTP triggers that load a queue, and then have queue triggers. So sorry. Apologies, I didn't mean to shut the solution. So once you've made your function app, then we need to take stock on a few things that are relevant to our development. If you're greenfield development, then you probably won't have any problems, but if you're doing brownfield, this one could really trip you up. So the first time that I did this, I introduced some existing in-house projects, solutions, made project references, and I didn't see that the version I was using at the time, so this one's 10.13, which is the current one, but I didn't realise at the time that the version I was using was locked onto 9.0.0.0, and everybody had moved on from there. And one of the things you need to bear in mind is that there's no assembly binding redirects in function apps. It's no more than what you're looking at. So if you get a conflict, you'll just get a conflict, you'll get a runtime error. So yeah, it'll catch you out. So if we have a look at a really simple one, we can see that I've got a simple class here. It's going to take made up confirmation details. And when this runs, we're just going to do some basic checking on whether or not the confirmation type is within our allowed types. So when you develop them locally, you get the ability to access them through a local server. So it just takes a minute. Sorry, it's never taken that long. Yeah. No. I can zoom in.
I think that's the intent of the question.
No.
can't change the font size in the top left menu.
Should be under properties. And there should be a font tab, I think, at the top.
Sorry, don't change this. Is that going to be enough? Apologies, I'm just trying to see why it's not running.
Does it need a debug parameter?
Ah, yeah, apologies.
I think most people are watching, something has to go wrong for them.
Don't make it. So it's done my gods, yeah.
There we go. Thank you, James. Nice one. Yeah, so this is a really nice experience for the developer, because unlike the logic apps, which we'll see later on, the function apps, they've provided a local host so that you can actually hit it with a payload, do some basic debugging. If you have any interactions with the storage, they provide a storage emulator as well, so that you can read and write to the file system. So yeah, that's a nice benefit of how they've approached it. It's a good development experience. So if we drop a breakpoint on and call that, so we can see that we've parsed the parameters into the object, and we have intentionally hit a failure because the business logic hasn't been implemented for the type passed in. So we passed in an email confirmation, but in this enum it doesn't know about email in the enum. So we're going to get a bad request. And if we have a look why, that's because I made the enum have an error. Let's go again. And this time we've got success, so I think that's a really friendly environment for us to be developing in. It's nice that it all runs offline.
So would functions be typically like short-running kind of API things? Because like presumably if there was some number crunching or something going on, you probably want to crack open a fully fledged API approach.
Yeah, so when they started with serverless functions, they were quite strict with the timeouts. I think they were about 2 minutes.
Right.
I think they're a lot higher now. I think they're past 10 minutes now. And there was a lot of guidelines which I'll come to if I don't cover them now or during. I'll come to them at the end. So things like being stateless, running quickly,
Yeah.
Asynchronous methods all the way, and yeah, I mean they're not for long running jobs.
The HTTP ones are not for running jobs.
Yeah.
We've got Azure functions that do like the database maintenance. They run for 8 hours.
Yeah.
And are they in the? Are they
run on a schedule? As
Yeah.
A schedule trigger as opposed to HTTP
But-
trigger.
But are they the long running version?
Yeah, so it's on a service plan.
Yeah.
So if you're not on a service plan, you're capped at 10 minutes or an
Right.
hour, something like that.
Yeah. So
Yeah, the other's consumption plan, that's it.
Yeah, just because the thing that always, the question I always have with this is, like, why isn't everyone cracking functions up for API work? You know, when would you? So that's why I'm asking the question, like, is it just for short running, a function's just for short running kind of endpoint requests and response type scenarios? And you've answered that, so that was kind of where my thought process was.
yeah, like I say, if you're in a service plan, you've effectively got a machine running on your behalf.
Yeah.
So the cold starts go away. So you've got to kind of understand your scenario, because if you've got the service plan, you've got the advantage of no cold starts and long running processes, and that's great if that meets your needs. But then the sort of, if you like, perfect use case for a consumption plan is to have an uneven load. So, you know, some businesses have a monthly process or whatever, or there's an event. So, you know, when the AWS guy was here, he was talking about, you know, if you've got a one-off event. So, you know, you know, where I work, we have annual events. So, like the Grand National is an event that we have to prepare for, and most of our services require bolstering.
Yeah.
So they're great for uneven loads on a consumption plan, but they're also great for long running processes on a subscription, on a service plan. So yeah, it's a matter of picking which one meets your needs. So I've only used them in a consumption plan for short running atomic pieces of logic. So things like generating documents from metadata, calling third-party APIs, calling internal APIs, discrete business logic. So those are the sort of things that I would use these for and have used these for.
Is a cold start that noticeable?
Yeah. So this morning.
Milliseconds.
Varies. So in the last day, I've been tracking it for that reason. So I've got between 700 milliseconds and a second and a half, 1500 milliseconds.
Right.
So depending on how critical your business need is, depending on how sensitive your process is. Sorry, the point that I was making with this one was that I've used the parameter binding, automatic parameter binding. If we have a look at one that's been written to be consumed by a logic app, then in version 2 of the functions, which is .NET Core, at the moment I'm having to resort to the HTTP request message, because in version 1, which was .NET Framework, they had a built-in editor in Azure for the Swagger, the OAPI, and it worked really seamlessly. Now the stuff that I've read recently about version 2 is you need to use the API manager to inspect an initial version of your function. So in this case, it would effectively just treat that as the body, and similarly work on the basis that there's a sort of a string response or whatever. That's what you get by default, and then you're supposed to be able to go in and use the new editor in the API manager for functions 2 based on .NET Core but I haven't got it working, and unfortunately the error just says try again later. So there's no logs or anything to tell me why. The first one, to be fair, was pretty was pretty temperamental. Sometimes I would log on and it would lose my last API, and I got into the habit of saving it. Sometimes I would log on and it would be blank. Sometimes it would work absolutely fine. So having worked with this for 2 years, I kind of get into the habit now of saving things pretty quickly into Notepad or just some offline storage before I've checked it in. Yeah, just because it has a habit of losing generated files. But this one, as I say, is written for consumption by a logic app, so it's got a flat request and response, and it does similar logic to before, but when this one runs, we're going to return the confirmation type on the assumption that we found it in the enum. So yeah, because we've updated the enum to allow SMS and email, we've got a 200 OK, so 224 milliseconds locally. So if we think about deploying these now, so by default you get the publish option, and when you first connect you won't have any connection to Azure, it won't know where it's going or what it's being called. So you have to fill in all these parameters, but it connects you to your subscription anyway. You have to log into your subscription to start filling in the parameters. And if we give this a push and then have a look down in the output. So it's not very obvious that you have to look in the output window, but basically what you're looking for in here is whether or not it was successful. It does it on a file by file, so it's a little bit unusual that when you use the Visual Studio publish, you get this kind of file by file, as we can see here. I don't know if everybody can see it, but you get a sort of file by file view. But when you are in a CI/CD scenario, obviously we don't want to be sitting in Visual Studio clicking publish. So one of the things that you need that I understand when I'm working in Azure is there's like 9 ways to do things. There's, you know, they've got APIs, there's the Azure, the CLI. So there's so many ways to work with the logic app, the function app. So I guess we need to now talk a little bit about the ecosystem that a function app lives in. So Azure has resource groups. At the moment we're looking in a resource group that I've just arbitrarily called Tech Talk Resource Group VS for Visual Studio, because you can use VS Code, you can write them by hand, you can use any editor that you want, but the richest experience is in Visual Studio. So again, I'm not going to give a massive intro into Azure, but when your resources live in a resource group, that I guess the main pieces of information is where in the world and what subscription plan. So where in the world really matters. If you start thinking of these as you know, products or projects within an organisation of a non-trivial scale, then your resource groups can be anywhere in the world. When you create them, it'll ask you where you want them. And yeah, there we are. So I've chosen North Europe. I found it's cheaper than UK West and UK South. So this is what your deployed function app looks like. Just give it a second to inspect the deployment. This function should open, there we go. So it's found our two functions, and one of the things that's caught me out in the past is CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. By default, this has got a load of addresses in that are internal to Azure, and I found that if I don't change those, then I can't call them externally. So if we have a look at some of the Azure commands for deploying this. So, as I say, there's many interfaces into working with Azure. The one I used to use was the API that takes a zip, but I discovered recently that there's a publish web app that's certainly new to me.
So how are you generating that zip file?
Yes, I'm going to go and do that in a second.
Oh, right.
But yeah, this is much nicer than the previous incarnation, which there. So that's what it used to look like, calling an API via PowerShell, but this version's a lot better. The commented out commands are the previous version of the Azure PowerShell commands, so those are the ones that I've used for years, and the new ones are in a new namespace, and they're not compatible. You can't mix them in a session. So this new publish web app is, I think, the most elegant version of deploying the zip file. But if you're using Octopus Deploy or genuine Azure DevOps in Azure, then they've got dedicated steps for app service deployments. So you won't need to come down to this level. I'm just showing this because I don't know what people's pipeline is, and this is compatible with anything. So if we go back and do a release build, which is where I've tripped myself up earlier with it not being able to debug. So basically you just take a zip of the release.NET Standard 2 folder, and although it won't break if you leave it in, you just deselect the local settings. That's just allowing you to do a developer override. Local settings is for development, and you can have a release version as well. If we make that into a zip file, copy that to where our deployment script lives. Just take the name of the previous incarnation. So I've already run the import module command and the connect to AZ account command. So when you run it interactively, you'll get an actual pop-up dialog. But if you want to put this through a pipeline, there is an equivalent that takes all your login and password, which is why we're not using that version. I don't know if you can see that. Again, it's asking if we want to override our existing deployment. Which we do, and again there's a switch to turn those dialogues off. There we go, the world's biggest confirmation message. So having deployed it, we get our own URL. Hope people can see that. Yeah, you get your own URL on Azure, and although it's not the API, you also get a quick check that everything's up and running. So we can now go back and actually call that again with Postman, but this time we've gone to Azure, gone through our function app. Took 1.4 seconds this time. I guess that's a cold start, so that's probably too long for some people's production system. So again, if you wanted to take advantage of the consumption approach with uneven loads, then if this stuff matters to you, but you have some idea of your uneven load, so if you know, for example, you've got your monthly load, then there's nothing stopping you from doing your own warm-up warm-up approach, hit your URLs a few times before you need them. So that's a whistle-stop tour on the function apps. So again, back to the the general guidance for using them, async all the way, because you're paying for the compute on a consumption model. If you've got blocking threads or things that you're waiting for, then your costs will go up, and the bigger the scale that you operate at, the more your costs are going to be. I wouldn't advise, as a design approach, having functions that call other functions. They shouldn't really end up nested. Again, you'll end up incurring further overhead, and I think just getting yourself tied up in knots. Be aware of the cold starts if you're requiring response times to be quite aggressive. So if you're trying to make a business process, what I'm saying is, don't try and do it on long function apps, calling function apps. Take advantage of the fact that the function apps can read and write to the queues, the Azure Service Bus, the SQL tables. So make your triggers either the timers or the HTTP that loads into those queues, tables, and a function service bus, and then make your next function something that reacts to that queue, does something atomic, puts it into another queue. And if you want to avoid logic apps, is what I'm saying, then string them all together using message queues, service bus, and tables.
That's 40 minutes.
It's what, sorry?
40 minutes.
Cheers. So just like before, if you want to work with the logic apps, then you need to install that extension, Azure Logic Apps tools. That's going to give you the ability to create the project type, and it's also going to give you the editor. Sorry. So yeah, unlike the function apps that you get a dedicated one-to-one mapping in Visual Studio, the logic apps are more of a generic resource. They're based, they're JSON in nature, and they're not code. So the way that they've implemented it at the moment is that you need to add a resource group, and then having got a resource group, you can then start adding logic apps. Once you've installed that extension, you get the editor. The advantage of doing it in Visual Studio, because there's nothing stopping you going into Azure and just clicking like create new logic app. The problem with that is you don't get a means to redeploy it. So they're live basically from the moment you create one. It's live. It's endpoint. As soon as you click save, it's got an endpoint, and you can't redeploy it. If you start in Azure, you can't redeploy it. So you want to start in Visual Studio.
I'm guessing there's better source code control options as well.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. So this is a nice update. So in the past, you've had to write your own PowerShell. I'm certainly not going to go through this line by line, but suffice to say that that script they've written there is, you know, considerably more helpful than when I was working on this in its predecessing state, because all you got was the JSON. So once you've created your logic app, you do get a visual editor, but in reality it's JSON in ARM format, and then you deploy it with as a more generic resource, which is why it's in a resource group project, and there's no one-to-one mapping. So I was let's open up an empty logic app just to show you the possible triggers. So in the same way as functions have a whole host of ways to be started, it's the same with logic apps. So HTTP request is the version that we've gone for, but messages in a service bus queue, event grid, file on OneDrive, new email, and then this section below they're always working on. So when I started with this, there was almost no built-in workflows, but they keep working on this. There's a lot of interesting ones. A lot of social media steps have come along over the last couple of years. But I think for most business consumers, you're generally going to be reading and handling client data. So let's go back. So when you create the HTTP trigger version of the logic app, it needs a schema, and if you give it an example payload, it'll generate the schema for you. So that's what I did here. I'm not going to go through that. Interesting. Let's close that and reopen. So I've gone for a simple workflow just so we can understand how logic apps can handle some logic and how we can delegate some logic to some functions that we've written. So the first thing that this one does is checks whether or not the auth key matches some predetermined value, and then if we get past that check, then we're going to call the function app that we've written, and if that's valid, then we're going to send an email. So again, deploying these, you can either deploy them having filled in all the parameters, and that's fine for if you're developing this in a dev subscription, but it's not good enough for a production scenario. So we've just deployed that to Azure, and if we go and have a look at the editor, it's got the same layout. The difference is now we can actually get at the URL, so we can start giving it some traffic. So that, again, I don't know if you can see it, 734 as a cold start. I think the best I've ever had. Yep.
Is there any equivalent of writing any kind of unit test for these? You know, to actually test the logic?
Not for logic apps, no. So it's a good question. Thank you. Logic apps don't support testing, unit testing, or anything. You can only call them. But going back to the function apps, the best way to write the function apps is to write your code in the traditional way of writing your own assembly with a test library at the side of that, and then really using the function app as just a housing, just a way to call a tested set of logic. So yeah, I think the only way that you would be able to test these would be with a suite of integration tests and then check the results.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was and is one of my concerns, is that if you're going to use logic apps, regardless of whether you use them with functions, don't let an individual workflow get too big, because they get a bit unwieldy. I mean, you can see even in the editor, this is a small workflow just for the purposes of an introduction. The workflows that I've worked on in production are probably 10 to 15 steps, and even then they get out of hand really quickly. So you get this run history when you're not editing. So if we go in and have a look at the effect of calling the logic app through Postman, what we can see is all we're ever going to get is 202 accepted. We're never going to get a different response because it's not an API. We're not going to get a HTTP response. 202 just says I've received your request.
Doesn't it give you a polling API?
It's what, sorry?
A polling API. So 202 is generally, yeah, I've got your request. When you want a status on that request, go to this API to check the status of it.
I don't know if they've implemented that.
Suppose there
It'll
might
be
be
in
something in the headers.
response headers if it's there, yeah.
Oh, sorry, it is. Don't think any of those look like it's wanting you to poll anything.
I think it scrolls further as well though.
It's what?
I think it scrolls further.
Should we have a look? What, down? Oh yeah. So now I still don't think that there's a polling.
Okay.
So, first time I saw this, I thought it was extremely cool. You know, you've got a run history you click on any of the instances and then you get the tick as to the story that it went on. So that particular one, so we can see here it does a render of the received parameters. Hold on, sorry. Apologies, I actually went to a sister one. Right, there we go. That's the one we've deployed. So what we can see from this one is it's actually misleading. So what I mean is we've got a green down the side, and if we have a look at the flow, we never made it through check auth key. So one of the flaws, I think, is there's no automatic failure for the logic app if it simply goes down a different leg. So because this false on the check has nothing in it, as far as Microsoft's concerned, that's fine. We just fell out of the logic. So that's obviously not what we want. So we have to come back to our designer and add the terminate, and then you get to choose how have you terminated. So I generally use that as failed. You can put error codes and messages in. I'm not going to, because we've used an hour. Let's crack on. But just to complete the journey, let's put one on our other failed leg. And again, that's a failed. So yeah, so now we've got a hopefully more intelligent, more complete logic app. So again, we've two ways to deploy. You've got the deploy through the local dialog, which is fine for making these sort of changes and pushing them up. But we've also got the PowerShell. So let's deploy it the first time, I guess, using the command, at least so we can see what it does. Doesn't take very long, but what you might hit when you're deploying either the function app or the logic app is errors, not all of which are meaningful, around files in use and that sort of thing. So on both the function app and the logic app, there's stop on the function app and there's disable on the logic app. So if you're getting those sort of errors about things being in use, you just need to come in and turn them off, in effect, stop them being used, and then you can upgrade them. So that gave us a successful deployment, and we should be able to see the same changes now. So there we go, we didn't have a terminate on either of those. So we go back to our run history, and this again is something that I think it is really very cool, as well as seeing it where it got to and what the payload was and what the steps were. Resubmit. So this was a dream come true when running a real production system. So having developed it on a developed instance of Azure, having gone to the trouble of deploying that to a production instance, we started taking a couple of thousand hits from our client, and a percentage of them had errors that we hadn't considered for an edge case. So in most systems, when you get that scenario of the customer sent their batch of thousands and some of them failed, generally either they or you need to start digging out GUIDs, IDs, whatever, to create a second fixed batch to redeploy. So when we had this scenario here, we rang the client up and we went, sorry, a small number of your submissions have failed, however, just leave it with us and we'll fix it. So this, are you sure you want to resubmit? It was amazing. Imagine that, not having to create the batch again. So we've sent the same parameters off, and this time, because we've changed nothing, we can actually see that we've gone down the same leg, but now the run on the left shows us it's a failed run. So it's far more useful to us now. We know why we're failing, and we can see that the reason that we failed was because the check auth key failed.
So if you call that, sorry, I think you're about to do what I'm going to ask. If you call it with Postman, will I get a 400?
No, because Postman will only ever give you 202 as long as you meet the contract in the starting step.
Right.
Basically, it doesn't know what's going to happen after that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it won't tell me that I failed to log in.
Log in?
Well, or
no, because that's just some business logic later in the process.
Okay.
If you meet the contract for step 1, you're into the logic app, and because it's not a request response relationship, that's why it gives you 202. It says, thanks, I'll go on and get on with this job that you want me to do, that's of an indeterminate amount of time. Okay. And certainly the ones I was working on, which I'll give the story of what they were, how useful they were, the time and the money before we finish today. They were running at about 3.5 minutes. So yeah, generally you wouldn't want to be hanging around on an automated submission to a HTTP endpoint for 3.5 minutes.
I'm guessing as well you're going to put a proxy endpoint in front of this.
So that's again one of the out of scope security, yeah, but also everything that goes with it. So let's detour there for a second. So these URLs, as we can see, are not friendly. We do not want to be giving our clients that, like, oh brilliant, call our endpoint, lovely. We don't want to be giving that to our clients. So the function apps and the logic apps can sit and should sit behind the Azure API Manager. It's a big topic in its own right, but it gives you a load of goodies. So it'll do authentication, whatever, it supports just about everything going at the moment. It'll do API rewrites, so it'll turn these into something nice. It can rewrite parameters or change get to post. It can do all these sort of things. Caching, profiles. I don't know what else, James. You've touched it recently.
Mocking. You can do mocking.
Mocking. There you go. You get free mocking.
Policies basically you get with it out of the box. So yeah, pretty much what you say, really.
Yeah. So, like I say, I'm not going to demo it because it just makes this talk even bigger. But that's all the goodies that you get in the API Manager. So certainly, if you're going down a production route, you don't want to be doing this stuff with horrible URLs. So we've changed it now. We still get 202. We're always going to get 202. But now we've managed a green run. So we've passed our auth key check. We've gone through our function app. It tells us what we got on the way in. It tells us what we sent on the way out. We didn't bother formatting the response. We didn't put it into JSON. We just returned a flat piece of text, and then we passed the request is valid check, which was to make sure that it was an email before we send an email. And then, unfortunately, behind the scenes, I just emailed John Doe at nowhere in particular. But the steps have all worked. So that's deploying it. That's deploying it from Visual Studio. And if you want to deploy it in PowerShell, which we do, then you simply take the command that they produce for you and use the deploy script that they've given you. So again, it's not the nicest thing to read, but that line there is calling their script on an existing PowerShell session. So this session just has the extra commands. So it's the old PowerShell, so it's calling import module Azure RM, connecting to the Azure RM account using the old way, and then, as I said, it's calling I mean, you can tell just from looking at them the format. So it's calling deploy it's calling that script, and behind the scenes that script is calling new Azure RM group deployment, which is which way are we going? So that is, just from looking at it, that is of the old naming style. So I need a second PowerShell window, because like I say, you can't load them both in the same session, and you get warnings anyway as soon as you start calling one or the other. You get warnings about, I'd rather you'd only had one of these installed on your machine. So that is much quicker to deploy than the function app. And we haven't changed anything, but it's just showing you both ways to deploy it. So just to prove that we haven't broken it and it's still what it was before we deployed it. So there we go. It's all still there, having deployed it. So I showed you the prerequisite for having Azure Logic Apps and Tools extension installed. I found out today, annoyingly, that the latest stuff that you use for deploying function apps via PowerShell rather than via the API requires PowerShell 5.1. That was a very long install, one of those classic ones that has a progress bar that does absolutely nothing until literally minute 59, and then it's just 100% done. So be patient with the 5.1 PowerShell installer. It's going to take a really long time and suddenly complete. Again, for those who have used PowerShell, there's warnings all the time about untrusted libraries and assemblies and commands. So you'll have to normally set your execution policy to unrestricted. I had a look at the triggers that were possible. Rename your steps as you go. So in the designer, all the steps by default just have things like, just have default names. So if you just click on the sub-menu and just choose rename, it just makes life a lot easier. I mean, these things have ended up with a default name of Terminate 1, Terminate 2 because we didn't spend time on them, but generally I would take the time as soon as you've added a step just to put a more meaningful name in, otherwise you end up with just the name incrementing 1, 2, 3. Hidden trigger settings. So when you start doing this for real, what you'll experience is that it's a case of a weakest link. So in the logic apps that I was working on, it was triggered by a business process that meant a candidate had finished their work, and we then had to call our own APIs to get a load of metadata about the candidate. Those APIs weren't as fast as Azure is, and they weren't as fast as some third-party libraries. So what you find is that your logic apps will need tuning. So by default, it tries to do everything in parallel and at quite a good scale. So I think you get somewhere between sort of 30 and 50 sort of parallel threads by default. Now that may just be too much for your systems. So one of the things that you can do when you're working on the for each steps is to go into those settings and just choose the parallelism. So for some of them I had to bring it all the way back down to 1, so I effectively turned the for each back into a code for each, a sequential for each. But by default you have to understand that a for each in logic apps is a parallel operation, and it might catch you out. First time I did one, it caught me out because I was expecting a sequential behavior. So yeah, there's hidden settings in the code view. So down here on the parameters, there are some parameters that aren't there by default. They're not available in the editor, but if you need those, you can change your initial queue size and your initial parallel threading, again just to try and make it run at the speed of everything else that you know it's calling. So we had to increase the queue but decrease the parallelism because we wanted to put more things in batches, but we knew that they would then run slower than Azure wants to run at. Error conditions. So even on a normal step, rather than, why is it doing this? Let's close that and reopen it. Even on a normal step, that isn't a decision, there's always multiple options to deal with the outcome. So even though this one isn't in itself a true false, we can add a step here and let's, I don't know, I guess we terminate again. So this one there it is, sorry. Configure the run after. So by default, all connections that take you to the next step are assuming success, so they link by success. But what you can do is start adding failure steps. So we change that to the failure conditions. What you get. It should have been that way, shouldn't it? the editor doesn't help. Anyway, you can have two exits from any step and handle the failure of them, rather than only having the success step.
It's like retry policies.
Yeah, so by default, another nice that we found on successful runs actually. So we were looking at general performance and you know how it was running, what the timings we were getting. What I didn't realise is that there's built-in retries into all of the built-in steps. So some of them were successful because of the built-in retry policy, and I think it's 5 by default. So it'll try, and it's got an exponential delay, so it'll go up like on a polynomial or whatever it is. It'll go up unevenly on a scale, so it'll fail, wait, fail again, wait even longer, and it'll keep going. So I think you get 5 retries, and the ones that were working for us were typically coming through on the 2nd or the 3rd. So again, you know, that's a headache that we don't have to deal with, and it works with the function app steps. So my function app steps, like I said, were either calling more APIs, generating documents from metadata, applying business logic. So if they weren't having a successful ongoing conversation with a third party, we got retries for free, and it was causing the overall. It was causing the run to be successful overall. So the security considerations we've touched on. I mean, if anyone's, I mean, it's an endless topic, is the security. So when you put your authentication into the API manager to get nicer URLs to get authentication, it doesn't change the function app. So the signature that we've seen here doesn't change. So unlike MVC, where we'll see authorization attributes, they're not added to this. This is not a part work in terms of what it would look like with security in the way. The security handles all the SSL termination, all the authentication. So by the time you hit your function, you're clear of all that. There are optional parameters on the function apps, and if you're using an authentication, for example, that identifies the user, like those who are used to Windows authentication, identifying the user on a network, if you're using an authentication mechanism that ultimately identifies a user, then one of the optional parameters is a principal, so you can start to understand the metadata about your user who's got through security. The security, and looking at security differently. So in Azure you can have private networks, so you can stop any of this being visible. You can make it so it could only be called internally, so that you can go a really long way with it, which is why it's a whole topic all to itself, and I've lost days of my professional career attending meetings on Azure security. Serverless thinking, so things like the for each on the logic app are going to catch you out the first time round, because if you think of them in the traditional way, you might expect the first run to cause some sequence to be either updated or generated, but you can't think about them that way anymore, because they're going to run. We just had to do the work up front. So I generated the list of unique IDs, and then they got passed in as a parameter that was already part of their payload, and it worked as expected. Like I say, it took a bit of re-engineering, and again going back to the function apps and what we were talking about earlier. So think about the shape of your traffic, and if you had a weird thing like your traffic's kind of always at a level, but then it also spikes monthly, I would go with 2 of these. I would go with 2 URLs, two function apps, so one that's on a subscription and always on, and then a consumption one that handles the peak. And in terms of sort of, I don't know, selling this up the line through to management, you know, not having containers, not having servers, not having IIS, not having patching, you know, these are the sort of things that we've enjoyed by using this technology. It's not a panacea. I'm not saying shove all your existing business logic into serverless functions. Definitely not. It's got its uses. Lessons learned. I think we've covered most of those. I guess a general lesson learned is Azure is changing all the time. As I said, only today I realised that there was a nicer way of deploying the function apps rather than that old API wrapped up in PowerShell. As I said earlier, the open API Swagger stuff is a little bit unreliable. Well, maybe that's too strong a word. It's not always. It doesn't always work for me. I haven't got it working in version 2. It was hit and miss in version 1. I haven't got it working in version 2. But that's only from the point of view of something that I'm trying to merge with function apps. If you're writing them for direct consumption, then I think they work a lot better. Running costs. So when I used this in anger, we ran nearly 10,000 business processes for, as I say, candidates. So we had to talk to our own API, we had to talk to third-party APIs to do some document conversion, all asynchronously. We had to then write a final document to either a Google Doc or a Dropbox or whatever you want to think of as where the generated documents go. And for, as I say, almost 10,000 of these, the running costs at the time, again it depends on your subscription, depends on your agreements with Microsoft, but at the time it was under £5, which, you know, I found staggering because I'd just come from the subscription world where we were deploying either VMs or the app service, which is the IIS equivalent of Azure. So so I was used to these always on costs. So to get a month's worth of variable demand compute for under £5, and the effort I'd put in was certainly no more than if I'd wrote it for IIS. So that was a nice surprise. I don't know what we were expecting, but it wasn't a £5. So apologies for my nerves this evening. I've clearly been nervous. Hope it's not been too much for you guys at that side. But if anyone's got any questions, I know people have asked them along the way.
Okay, I've got a question.
Yeah.
So, logic apps versus functions. When would you use one or the other? In my company, we've tried to go logic apps a few times, and then maybe because I was one doing it, maybe because I didn't know enough about them, but I very quickly went, stop that, and then writing a function instead. I guess I'm interested, when is a logic app a good idea, and when should you probably not have gone that route?
For me, I would always pair them, and the logic app, what I like about it is all that ecosystem. So the fact that it captures the payload, the fact that you can rerun it, the fact that when you want to see why it was successful, why it failed, it's got all the timings in there. The application insights will give you the finer metrics, you know, what was your average runtime, etc., where's my slow points. So it's really good for finding out which bits are fast and which bits are slow, because the bits that are fast, you want to allow the full parallelism that's built in, and the bits that are slow, like I said, I had to bring the for each slider all the way back to 1 for the slow stuff. But what I like about all that is the rerun retries policy that's built in. So as glue for logic apps, for the function apps. So the function apps, as I said, in an ideal world are atomic, they execute fast. I would always aim for less than a second. They should be stateless, although there are ways to work with that. It does have a local app settings. There's also something that Microsoft have never stated is a feature, and I understand why, because of the way that the containers work. When you go to a cloud, it's full of these shipping containers. I understand how all that works. So if you create static variables in function apps, they will actually share across instances that are on the same host. So it's not truly static, because if you scale up enough, you might be across three shipping containers, and if you are, then that static is 3 instances of the static. So it doesn't work for something that you need to be truly global. At that point, you'd have to go back to a truly shared resource like a database or something else, some message queue.
So is a logic app sort of more the glue that ties more complicated processes together? You wouldn't start trying to write a complicated business process as a logic app with a particular sort of tree structure.
No, that's what I say. I find the editor is quite clunky, and very quickly will start scrolling huge amounts of scroll bar.
Yeah, so you might have as one of the steps in there an Azure function that you'd written. Can you do that?
As many as you want, yeah. I mean, the ones I was working on probably had 4 custom steps, because like I said, there's custom steps for talking to our own API, custom steps for talking to the conversion service, custom steps for generating documents from metadata, and other discrete business logic steps. So all of those were nicely controlled by the fact that...
Can a custom step be an Azure function?
It is an Azure function.
No.
That's what I'm saying. So the
oh, okay, sorry, I understand. Yeah.
So the editor, that's validate request there is validate request there.
Of course, yes, sorry.
So sorry.
Yes.
I don't know if I should have made that more clear, but ultimately that lightning icon is the function app symbol.
Yeah. I think I missed that bit, but that makes a lot more sense now.
Yeah. So for me, if you follow the rules of like being stateless, the logic app is the thing that is handling the state for you. So it's got a really rich library of JavaScript functions. So you can do things like convert base 64 to binary. So when we were doing the final file drop, those particular APIs required a binary stream. So you can convert what you got earlier from the conversion service as base 64. You can convert that into a binary stream, ready for the next service. They've got a lot of things like string splitting, or convert things to JSON from JSON. It'll do the for each logic for you if you've got a JSON collection.
That combined with what you were saying about the retry thing, particularly like the last place I worked in, we sort of processed orders and placed them with car parks, and there was one guy who wasn't supposed to be his full-time job, sort of working out what went wrong with these things, but it sort of became his full-time job of trying to track them down. I think if we'd had an infrastructure more like this, it would have made him a lot happier.
Yeah, well, that's what I said. So when I handed this over to the support department and showed them the run history and the fact that the guy can just click, on anything that worked or.
How long does it keep that history for? So when something's failed, how long?
It's based on your own retention policy. Okay, so it's up to you. You can either have it by time or by storage size.
Presumably you pay for the storage.
Yeah. So because most of my projects have been either government or financial, so we're worrying about PII, personally identifiable information. So one of the problems that this gives you is this. So yeah, so basically all this could be PII. So it's great from a technical point of view, but you are going to have to, sit down with the architects and sit down with legal. And when you choose the resource group in the first place, you're going to have to choose the right area. So when I was working for the government, we were not allowed to have our data centres or any element thereof outside of the UK, so we could only choose UK South. UK West didn't even exist.
So because obviously this is similar to Flow as well.
Yeah.
In Flow, I've seen a new thing, you can define a field as secure. Do you know what that is? 'Cause I haven't played with it.
I haven't touched
And
that
with
one, no.
Stops it getting logged.
It'll probably just asterisk out the values, because that's similar to how TFS and things like that as well. Once it's marked as secure, it just uses stars when you actually try to view it on the web browser.
Yeah.
You'd
So
still be able to retry it, but it'd be
Exactly. Yeah. So
Yeah.
it would store a secret as to what that value actually resolves to, or how to resolve it. But for anybody who's trying to use it, it would just be stars. So that's usually how the secret works on.
But yeah, like I said, the you know, the chap who worked with me on this in the support department, this was a dream come true for him, and it was for us. Like I said, this resubmit is just amazing. You know, the first time that it fails on behalf of your customer, and you ring them up and you go, I'm really sorry, you know, some of these have failed, but we're all over it. You know, give us 2 hours. You know, they were like, oh, okay. Thanks for the update, and 2 hours later, you know, the document appears where it should do in the format that it should do. So, you know, I think these are great. You know, I've worked with them for more than a year. I've worked with Azure since 2014. It is a little bit frustrating that it's always evolving and the things you get used to change, but generally for the better. Yeah,
Can you set up alerts when stuff has failed? So
yes. So Azure has a very rich infrastructure for not only for the application insights, which is the metrics, but then you can alert on those metrics, and there is a logic app step for a monitor threshold being reached. So one of the triggers that they've added since I last looked is that some values being exceeded. So typically that would be because you don't want something as simple as an email, because by default you can wire those up to discrete tasks like emails. But if you want to do something clever, then you know, maybe a logic app's the way to go, because I don't know if it's dealing with an alert on a fixed resource. So if you've got a server that's now stressed, the CPU's gone up, then the logic app could do a handful of things like spin up more hardware, add to the load balancer, and then maybe contact support, you know, your own people, sorry.
Yeah, I was still thinking more typically like, you know, one area you might be like, well, that's going to be alright, but if it's lots, then you'd want someone sort of like a certain threshold of failed requests or something like that.
Yeah, and you can create, you know, dashboards, and they can be very, very cumulative. So you can take things from across your subscription, which might have multiple resource groups across multiple areas, and you can create these master views. So, you know, I've certainly been into buildings where they've got lots of big tellies with all the pie charts and traffic lights and stuff like that, and it comes together really quickly and easily in Azure, and it's an area that was good anyway, but I think it's just an area that keeps getting better and better. So if we have a look at the history on I don't know, either of these, I guess. Have a look at the history on these live app metrics. So not only do we get the standard green stuff, how much of this worked, but this is kind of for those who are familiar with stuff like this was working.
That serves you out for winning.
Today. No, this was working today.
They're moving. Is it an animated GIF?
No, it says demo across it. That's really annoying, because it quite said it was working today. Is it that one? Sorry, I think that, yeah, I just clicked the wrong. So this is the one that will give you a finer timeline. There we go. There. So you just get all this stuff for free. Like so you get table view, the chart view. There is a timeline view. I don't know how I found that earlier today. There's a timeline view which will show you, you know, if you've used Kibana or Splunk, which we're using for real-time reporting and metrics, it'll give you that point in time, but that point in time can be anything. So it could be yesterday for 30 seconds. So you can do all that sort of stuff. If you know you had a problem yesterday during a very precise window, you can go in and have a look. So it makes life really nice for the support people.
Can you do a battery try with like loads of failed requests? Can you sort of go retry all the failed requests between this and this?
I haven't seen that.
Oh, there's going to be a PowerShell command for that.
Oh,
yeah. So all this infrastructure that's required, all this hosting plan, the hosting plan and the storage, all these things, when you create your first resource group, it will ask you, like I said, where in the world, what sort of premium plan, etc., and it'll generate all of these artifacts with whatever name and location you create them. But ultimately, it's very easy to get the ARM JSON that represents those, because what we've done today is redeploy the bit that changes. So we are going to work on our logic app, we are going to work on our functions, but the ecosystem is not going to change. The resource group doesn't need redefining, neither does the storage and the hosting plan. So as well as redeploying these to our target, our initial deployment can be all generated in ARM templates. And then I know, Colin, you said you've some experience of Terraform as well, so that's an alternative to spinning up infrastructure.
That's great, because I need to talk on Terraform. See me afterwards.
I'll see if I can recap on my experience. It was in a previous role when I was working in apps, which was only for about 6 months.
But as I say, I'm a big proponent of this pairing, because, like I said, if you take the approach as we do of tested projects, tested DLLs, you know, logic at the side of a test, and then just use the function app as a wrapper to call tested code.
Yeah, I think maybe they were missold to me a little bit originally. They were just sort of sold to me as a great thing that would do lots of stuff, but it's sort of seen that time between them makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Okay, can we call a halt there?
Yeah.
Thanks once again to Paul.
Thank you very much.
It's great to see a member of the community stepping up and giving us a talk. If you've got any suggestions of talks you might like to do, I think one of myself or Richard. We'll be getting under